This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, get ready, because we're going deep into how World War II totally changed things for the US and Canada. Not just battles and stuff like that, but like how it set the stage for like the world we live in today, economically, diplomatically, you know, the whole deal. Our guide for this is, it's a podcast episode called Economic and Diplomatic Shifts After WWII, the US and Canada, an overview. And let me tell you, it really dives deep. I think you're going to get a lot out of this one.
Yeah, it's amazing how all these things, the economics, social stuff, the diplomacy, it all gets woven together. You can't understand the big picture without looking at all those different threads.
Totally. Okay, so let's start with the U.S. Picture this. 1930s, the Great Depression, right? Everyone's struggling. And then, bam, World War II explodes, and all of a sudden the U.S. economy isn't just bouncing back, it's booming. How did that happen?
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. And the key is how quickly they shifted gears from peacetime to wartime production. President Roosevelt signs the War-Powers Act, basically giving him the power to reshape the economy. And then, in 1942, boom, the War Production Board is born. It's like their job was to make this giant industrial transformation happen, to orchestrate the whole thing. Think of it like a conductor leading an orchestra. But instead of musicians, it's factories all across America pumping out tanks and planes and all the stuff they needed to fight the war.
And we can't forget about rationing, right? It wasn't just factories changing. It was everyday life for people back home. Suddenly, they couldn't just buy whatever they wanted. Sugar, gas, everything was carefully portioned out to support the troops.
Oh, absolutely. It was a collective effort, a real shared sacrifice, everyone doing their part to make sure the resources went where they were needed most.
And this is where it gets really interesting because, you know, our source calls the U.S. the arsenal of democracy, which is a pretty powerful image. It wasn't just about gearing up their own military, it was also about helping out their allies through the Lend-Lease Act. But here's the thing, it wasn't just about helping other countries, it actually had a huge impact on the U.S. economy too, right?
Exactly. It was kind of like a win-win.
So they're helping their allies win the war, A&D boosting their own economy at the same time. How does that work?
Well, the Lend-Lease Act basically meant American factories had to produce way more than they ever had before. I mean, think about the Ford Motor Company. They were famous for their cars, right?
Yeah.
But suddenly, they're churning out thousands of B-24 Liberator bombers. And this wasn't just happening at Ford. It was happening everywhere. It helped win the war, sure, but it also left the U.S. with this incredible industrial base, ready to take on the world after the war.
Wow, that's amazing. But there's another big piece of this puzzle, isn't there? Millions of American men were off fighting, which meant a huge shortage of workers. And that's where Rosie the Riveter comes in, right? All those women entering the workforce for the first time. A total societal shift.
It's a pivotal moment in American history, for sure. World War II wasn't just about economics or battles. It changed how society thought about women and their roles. They stepped up and filled all these essential jobs, proving they could do it just as well as men. I mean, these were jobs that were considered men's work before operating machinery, welding, shipbuilding. And they were amazing at it. They showed their strength and skill and basically shattered all those old stereotypes. It changed how people saw women in society forever.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it really, like changed things for women. I mean, like way beyond the war years. But let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. What was happening globally after the war?
Right.
Europe and Asia, I mean, they were devastated, right? But the U.S., they come out of it stronger than ever.
Yeah.
And that sets the stage for them to become like the global leader economically and diplomatically,
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like everyone else is trying to rebuild and the U.S. is ready to go. And this is also when the U.S. dollar becomes like the currency, right? Like the world's reserve currency.
Yeah.
That sounds like a huge EE deal. Can you talk a little about the Bretton Woods conference? Why was that so important?
Oh, yeah, Bretton Woods, that was a big one. It was 1944, and you've got all these delegates, 44 allied nations, coming together to basically like rewrite the rules of global finance. This is where the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank are born, right? They're designed to keep the global economy stable and get everyone working together, cooperating,
Right.
And at the center of it all, you have the U.S. dollar. They pegged it to gold and basically said, this is the anchor. This is what everything else is tied to. It's like the U.S. dollar became the MVP of global currencies.
Wow. So it's like they go from being a major player to basically calling all the shots.
Yeah.
That's a lot of power. What did they do with it?
Well, they definitely used it. One of the biggest examples is the Marshall Plan. I mean, they poured over $12 billion into rebuilding Europe. And that's like over $100 billion in today's money. It wasn't just about being nice. It was a strategic move, with long-term goals.
Yeah, like, hey, Europe, here's $100 billion. No big deal, just helping a friend out.
Mm-hmm.
But seriously, that's an insane amount of money. What were some of the lasting effects of the Marshall Plan, besides, rebuilding all those countries?
Well, it definitely solidified their influence in Europe, right? It helped Europe recover economically, which was huge, and it strengthened their ties with Western Europe. And ultimately, it paved the way for NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That became a key player in the Cold War, basically dividing the world into two camps, the West, led by the U.S., and the East, led by the Soviet Union. But the Marshall Plan also had a cultural impact. Think about like Coca-Cola and all these other American brands and products suddenly popping up everywhere. It was like American culture was spreading, and that further cemented their influence globally.
It's amazing how these economic policies, they weren't just about money. They shaped everything, from politics to culture. And speaking of shifts, what about the U.S.'s foreign policy? They went from wanting to stay out of everything to being a major player on the world stage. What caused that change?
Well, Pearl Harbor was a big wake-up call, right? December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And suddenly, the U.S. can't stay isolated anymore. It pulls them into the war and forces them to engage with the rest of the world.
It's like all of a sudden they're thrust onto the global stage. And then you have Yalta and Potsdam, where the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union are basically trying to figure out what the world's going to look like after the war.
Right. These weren't just like casual meetings. It was high-stakes stuff. Decisions were made that would affect global politics for decades. I mean, they were dividing up Europe, figuring out what to do with Germany, and the future of Eastern Europe was at stake.
Yeah.
It really set the stage for the Cold War, and the balance of power globally.
And then there's the whole, the U.S. becomes a nuclear power, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those are stark reminders of the kind of power they now had. How did that change things? I mean, globally.
Well, it was like the world enters a whole new era, the nuclear age. Right. There's this constant anxiety, this fear of mutually assured destruction. They called it Mayday. The idea was if everyone has these incredibly powerful weapons, no one will use them. It'll be a deterrent. And that became a huge part of the Cold War, this nuclear standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
It's like the stakes were suddenly way higher, right?
Exactly. It wasn't just about armies and navies anymore. These weapons could cause unimaginable destruction. It completely changed the game of global power.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the U.S., but what about Canada? I mean, they weren't a superpower like the U.S., but they played a big part in the war, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Maybe not on the same scale as the U.S.,
Yeah.
but their contributions were huge. They were a major supplier of war materials, especially to Britain. Tanks, aircraft, munitions, you name it. One cool example is the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Basically, Canada became this massive training ground for Allied pilots.
And their economy, I think it actually doubled in size during the war, right? Was that just a temporary boost, or did it have a lasting impact?
Well, a lot of it was driven by wartime needs, of course.
Yeah.
But it definitely had a lasting effect. It helped diversify their economy, and it modernized their industries. It set them up for success in the post-war world, They needed aluminum for aircraft production during the war.
Right, yeah.
So that led to this whole aluminum industry booming in Canada, and they became a global leader in that area.
So it wasn't just about meeting the demands of the war, it was about building a stronger economy for the future. What about their role diplomatically? How did they navigate all that, with the U.S. and the Soviet Union being the big players?
Canada was very active on the world stage, especially through the UN and NATO. They weren't a superpower, but they were influential. They were like a middle power. They were all about diplomacy and peacekeeping. And they had their own voice, Often they were like a bridge between the superpowers trying to get everyone to work together.
Yeah, it's amazing how both the U.S. and Canada, even though they're so different in size and power, I mean, World War II really had this huge impact on them. Like, their economies changed, their diplomacy changed, and it really, set the stage for how the world looks today.
It's like a reminder that history, I mean, it's not just dates and battles and stuff. It's all connected. And what happens in one place can have these like ripple effects that last for generations. World War II is like the perfect example. It changed everything, politically, economically, socially.
Totally. And it makes you wonder, right? Like, what other events are happening now that are going to have these big long-term impacts? I mean, we talked about how World War II led to like The U.S. becoming a superpower, the UN, NATO, the nuclear age. But what about other stuff, things that maybe we don't even think are that important right now?
It's a good question to think about. We usually focus on what's happening right now, but it's the long-term consequences that really matter. Like think about the printing press, or penicillin, or even Sputnik. Those were big deals at the time, but their real impact, it played out over decades, even centuries, you know?
Right, like we said, the U.S. economy booming during the war, that set them up to be the leader afterwards. So maybe there are other things happening now that are going to shape the future in ways we can't even imagine.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand history, not just as like facts and dates, but as this living process that shapes everything, you know? The more we learn about the past, the better we can understand the present and maybe even make better choices for the future.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring how the world changed after World War II, especially for the US and Canada. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you learned something new along the way. And remember, history is still being made right now, today. So what's happening now is going to shape tomorrow, and who knows what the future holds. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep learning, because there's always something new to discover.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.